The rain came down in a soft, steady hush over San Francisco, mist curling along the edges of glass towers and pooling in the gutters of the Embarcadero. From the top floor of the ReedTech building, a 72-story monument of steel and sky, Jackson Reed stood alone, watching the city blur behind a pane of spotless glass. His office was silent, save for the whisper of the rain and the quiet tick of a clock he never looked at. He didn't need to. Time bent to him. Deals waited. Boards deferred. Jackson Reed had long since stopped rushing for anything. The world below pulsed with color, taillights streaking through fog, neon bouncing off wet pavement. But from up here, it all looked abstract, like a painting he couldn't touch. He took a slow sip from the crystal tumbler in his hand. The bourbon was expensive, older than most of his employees, but the burn barely registered. It was habit now, like everything else. Behind him, the office gleamed with cold perfection, chrome fixtures, Italian leather, walls lined with awards and framed headlines, the billionaire who changed AI forever. ReedTech, the future of everything. And yet, for all its grandeur, the room felt hollow. Lately, it always did. Jackson set the glass down and reached for the small box tucked in the drawer beneath his desk. Black velvet, no bigger than his palm. He opened it slowly, as if afraid the memories inside might still bite. Inside lay a simple gold locket. No diamonds, no embellishment. Just a name engraved in cursive on the back. Mariah. His fingers brushed it like it might vanish. She had been the only thing in his life not designed, not acquired, not optimized for success. She had just been. He closed the box gently and exhaled. It had been 24 years since she'd left, disappeared without a word. No goodbye, no explanation. He'd searched for her, tried to pretend he hadn't, told himself she'd been a phase, a pretty chapter in an otherwise flawless trajectory. But then she died, quietly, privately. And that's when the walls of his certainty had first started to crack. His phone buzzed on the desk. Melissa. He ignored it. She was probably checking in about dinner, the gallery event she'd RSVP'd them 2 weeks ago. She loved the spotlight, the photo ops, the perfectly posed image of power couple harmony. But Jackson didn't feel like smiling for cameras tonight. Not when the calendar on his screen glared the date back at him in bold, October 14th. He loosened his tie and walked out, not bothering to tell anyone. Let the board wonder where he'd gone. Let Melissa stew. Some things couldn't be explained in words or scheduled between meetings. Some things just had to be felt. The cemetery in Oakland was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you realize how loud the rest of the world had become. Jackson parked his sleek black Tesla beneath a weeping cypress, the hum of its engine vanishing into the rain. He walked the path alone, shoes sinking into damp earth, a small bouquet of white orchids in hand. Her favorite. Mariah never cared for roses. Too obvious, she used to say. Orchids were quieter, more complicated, like her. He found the grave by memory now. He didn't need directions. It was etched into him. Mariah Rivera, 1975 to 2020. Beloved mother, fierce friend, eternal soul. Jackson knelt, the rain soaking through the knees of his tailored slacks, and set the orchids down gently. He stayed there for a long moment, hand resting against the cold stone, the silence pressing against him like a weight. "I never stopped wondering," he murmured, "why you left, why you never called." His voice was rough, rusty from disuse. No one asked him personal things anymore. No one dared. "I built everything we used to dream about, Mariah. The towers, the company, the world-changing tech. It's all mine now, but none of it feels like it matters." The wind stirred the trees gently. It felt like she was listening. He looked up, blinking against the rain, and then he saw him, a young man standing a few yards away, tall, lean, dark hoodie soaked through, hands stuffed in the pockets. He held something small in his hand, a single flower, a lily, white and fragile. The boy stepped forward slowly, like the grave held a pull on him too. Jackson stood, wary. "You knew her?" The young man didn't speak at first. His jaw tightened. His eyes were dark, unreadable but familiar in a way that unsettled Jackson. "She was my mom," he said finally. Jackson froze. The rain fell harder now, but neither of them moved. "And if what she told me is true—" The boy's voice wavered, then steadied. "That makes you my father." Jackson felt the world tilt beneath him. The trees, the sky, the tombstone, all dropped away. The boy's face was emotionless, but his words sliced through years of certainty like a scalpel. "You're lying," Jackson whispered, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The eyes, the stance, the jaw. "I'm not," the boy said, stepping back. "But don't worry. I don't want anything from you." He turned, walked away, and was swallowed by the mist. Jackson stood frozen in the rain, orchids wilting at his feet. The grave had given him one answer, but it had just opened 100 more. Jackson didn't remember driving home. One minute, he was standing in the cemetery, the name Mariah carved into stone beneath his fingertips. The next, he was back in his penthouse, alone, wet, and shaking, in a way he hadn't in decades. The city glittered below him, fog curling around the lights like smoke in a glass. But it all looked different now. Off-kilter, unfamiliar. He stripped off his coat and let it drop to the floor, rainwater pooling on the dark hardwood. For once he didn't care. Let the silence judge him. Let the floors stain. Let everything crack open. That boy, his boy, had walked away without giving Jackson anything to hold on to. No last name, no contact. Just the sharp truth, dropped like a match on dry kindling. "She was my mom. You're my father." Jackson sat heavily on the edge of his couch and stared at the locket he had pulled from his drawer earlier. He opened it. Inside, a faded photo of Mariah smiled back at him. Wild curls, eyes lit with defiance, wearing one of his old shirts. He swallowed hard. A son. He had a son. And he never knew. The questions hit him all at once, vicious and fast. Why didn't she tell me? Why now? Why him? The door buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again, longer this time. He stood and walked toward the intercom like a man on autopilot. When he pressed the screen, Melissa's face appeared, perfectly composed. Glossy brown hair swept into a low chignon, earrings that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Jack," she said, lips tight, "you missed the event. Again." He stared at her through the screen. She looked like a stranger tonight. "I'm not doing this," he said flatly, reaching to cut the feed. "Excuse me?" Her voice sharpened. "We had a commitment. I had something else come up." "Something more important than launching your foundation?" He hesitated. "My son," he thought. The words perched on his tongue, foreign and heavy. Instead, he said, "Melissa, I'm tired." A pause. Her eyes narrowed, calculating. "Tired," she repeated like it was a foreign concept. "Jackson, you've been distant for weeks. I've ignored it, but tonight—" "Then stop ignoring it," he snapped. "Stop pretending this isn't just appearances. We're a good headline, a powerful pairing. But when was the last time you asked me something that didn't involve PR or optics?" She recoiled slightly, but recovered quickly. "When you're ready to be rational, call me." He didn't answer. Just shut off the screen. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was honest. He turned back to the living room, his eyes scanning the penthouse. Everything carefully curated, sleek and modern. It looked like a showroom, not a home, not a place a boy could grow up. He sank back into the couch and covered his face with both hands. The weight of the day settled into his chest like a stone. His son, a grown man now, probably in his 20s. He looked like Mariah, but there had been something in his jawline, something sharp and familiar, something Jackson recognized. What had she gone through, raising him alone, watching Jackson's face on magazine covers, hearing his name on the news? Had she hated him? Had she regretted ever loving him? A soft knock at the door broke the spiral. He frowned. No one ever knocked. Not at this hour. When he opened it, he didn't expect to see her. Claire Monroe. She stood there in jeans, a raincoat, and those same beat-up Converse she'd worn back in their Stanford days. Auburn curls damp from the rain. A cautious smile on her lips. "Thought you might need someone," she said. He blinked. "How—" "Melissa called me," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "She's concerned, which usually means pissed." Jackson let out a laugh. A short, sharp sound. "Figures." Claire glanced around the penthouse, then turned to him with a raised brow. "You okay?" "No," he said, surprising even himself. "Not even a little." She sat on the edge of the leather armchair and folded her hands. "Want to talk about it?" He hesitated. She wasn't part of his life anymore. Not really. They'd reconnected briefly over a charity project last year, shared a few lunches, danced around the edges of something once familiar, but he hadn't let her in. Not really. Now he found himself wanting to. "I saw someone today," he said finally, "at Mariah's grave." Claire's face softened. "You still go?" "Every year." She nodded. She'd known about Mariah. They'd all been close once before time and success split them apart. "I met a boy there," Jackson continued. "Young man, really. Said she was his mother." His throat tightened. "Said I'm his father." Claire stilled. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I never knew." She didn't respond right away, just looked at him, the silence stretching thick with emotion. Then she stood, walked over and sat beside him. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "Neither do I." They sat there for a while, shoulder to shoulder, the rain whispering against the glass like a lullaby. Finally, Claire said, "So what now?" Jackson looked at the locket still open on the coffee table. "I find him," he said. "I find him, and I try." Claire didn't smile, but she nodded, and that was enough. The morning after, Jackson sat at his kitchen island with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands. The penthouse was still, too still. No sound but the occasional hum of an appliance or the faint rush of wind against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the fog-draped bay. He hadn't slept. Not really. Just laid in bed staring at the ceiling while memory after memory came crashing in. Mariah's laugh, her scent, her fury when she believed in something with her whole soul. And now, a son. A man who had grown up without him, who stood in the rain and walked away like Jackson meant nothing. Maybe he didn't. Claire's presence had grounded him last night. Not with answers. She hadn't tried to offer those. But with something better. Quiet understanding. The kind that only someone who'd known you before the headlines and the power could offer. She hadn't asked for more. She never did. He pulled out his phone, stared at it for a long beat, and then hit dial. "Jackson." Her voice came through, warm and clear. "Thanks for last night." A pause. Then, "Of course. How are you?" He hesitated, still processing. "Do you want company or space?" He looked around the gleaming kitchen, all chrome and curated emptiness. "Company," he said. "I'll be there in an hour." He ended the call before he could second-guess it. Claire arrived in jeans again, a soft gray sweater and a low ponytail that made her look closer to the girl he used to know, the one who used to sit with him on the campus lawn arguing about tech ethics and throwing peanut M&Ms at his head when he got too self-important. She carried a brown paper bag and 2 lattes. "I figured you wouldn't have anything edible in this place," she said, setting the bag on the counter and tossing him a croissant. "I have food," Jackson protested. "You have truffle oil and 17 bottles of Napa's finest. That's not breakfast." He smiled despite himself. "You always were bossy. I prefer efficient." She sipped her latte and leaned against the counter, watching him. "So, have you decided what to do?" "I hired someone," he said. "Private investigator. I just want a name, a starting point." Claire nodded slowly. "That's fair, but what are you going to do when you find him?" He didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, he didn't know. "I missed 20 years, Claire," he said finally. "I can't buy those back. I don't even know if I have the right to want anything now." "But you do want something." He looked at her. "Yeah, I want to know him, even if he hates me." Claire moved closer. "You always thought control was power, that if you planned enough, strategized enough, you could win anything. Was I wrong?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "In business? Number in life, you lost the one person who ever loved you without terms." The air went still. Jackson's voice dropped. "Do you think she hated me, Claire?" "No," she said, and the word came without hesitation. "She didn't hate you. She was angry, hurt. But Mariah didn't hate you. She couldn't. That was her curse." He felt something tight in his chest unravel just a little. "I should have fought harder for her. Maybe, but you didn't. And now you have a chance to show up for someone else. So show up." He nodded, then cleared his throat. "What about you?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "Me? You're not married, no kids, still wearing the same Converse from '98. What are you running from?" She laughed, a low, easy sound. "I'm not running, I'm just choosing my own path. One that doesn't involve board dinners and 3-person calendars to schedule a weekend getaway." Touché. They sat in a companionable silence, the kind that doesn't need to fill space. Jackson felt his body unclench for the first time in days. "I don't want this to sound opportunistic," Claire said suddenly, "but the foundation, Mariah's name on it, maybe that's something." He looked at her, surprised. "You said she still matters," Claire continued. "Then let her matter, not just to you but to others. Her name should stand for something." A slow nod. "She'd like that." "I know." He watched her for a moment. Really watched her. The soft strength in her face. The way she didn't flinch from hard conversations. The way she didn't try to fix him, just offered space to figure it out himself. "I missed you," he said quietly. Claire met his gaze. "You never really looked." There was no anger in it, just truth. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. "Robert Vega, investigator." He answered. "Tell me you have something." "His name's Eli Rivera, 23, lives in Berkeley, studies mechanical engineering, works part-time at a motorcycle garage on Shattuck." Jackson's heart thudded. "Thank you," he said. He hung up. Claire raised an eyebrow. That was fast. "I have a name." Her expression softened. "Then go find him." "I will." Claire reached for her coat but paused before leaving. "And Jackson?" He looked at her. "Don't lead with guilt. Lead with truth. You owe him that much." He nodded. "And what do I owe you?" She smiled, faint and fleeting. "A better ending than the one we got last time." And then she left. This time Jackson watched her go and didn't look away. Berkeley smelled different than San Francisco. Less steel and ambition, more damp sidewalks, coffee grounds, and old trees clinging to their roots. Jackson hadn't been there in years, not since speaking at a tech summit where he'd left before the panel Q&A. Too unpredictable, too human. But today he wanted unpredictability. He parked his black Porsche 2 blocks away from the address the investigator had given him. The motorcycle garage sat just off Shattuck Avenue, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a rusted-out sign that read, "Jeans Custom and Repair." A line of old bikes leaned against the building like tired soldiers, and the scent of oil and metal hung thick in the air. He took a breath and stepped inside. The garage was a symphony of clanking tools, humming engines, and a classic rock playlist crackling from an old radio in the corner. A younger man glanced up from under a Harley, his face streaked with grease. "Help you?" the guy asked. Jackson scanned the space, heart thudding against his ribs like it had forgotten how to behave. Then he saw him. Eli was across the garage, crouched beside a Ducati, fingers moving confidently over an engine. He wore a dark gray t-shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing lean forearms dusted with grit. His hair curled slightly at the ends, damp with sweat. His focus was razor sharp. He didn't see Jackson at first, but Jackson saw him, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of his jaw, the furrow between his brows, the way he moved with quiet intensity. The other mechanic must have called out because Eli turned. His expression froze when he saw who was standing there. For a beat, neither of them spoke. Then Eli stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jackson cleared his throat. "I had to see you. You had your chance, at the cemetery. I wasn't ready then. And you are now?" Eli laughed, cold and clipped. "That's convenient." "I'm not here to make excuses," Jackson said. "I just want to talk." Eli's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to talk about. My mother's gone. You missed your window." "I didn't know," Jackson said, voice low but steady. "If I had—" "You would have what?" Eli snapped. "Flown in on a helicopter, written a check, hired a PR team to spin the story of your long-lost son?" Jackson flinched but didn't look away. "I would have shown up. I would have tried." "Well," Eli said, tossing the rag onto a nearby table, "you're a little late." Jackson looked around the garage, at the cracked floors, the worn equipment, the clock above the tool wall stuck at 3:17. He thought of the penthouse, the silence, the glass and steel and emptiness of it all. "I wanted to know your name," he said. "That's all I asked the investigator for. Just a name. I didn't plan a strategy or a script." Eli crossed his arms. "And now that you've got it?" "I don't know," Jackson admitted. "I'm not asking for anything. I saw you and I couldn't walk away. Not again." Eli's eyes burned. "You don't get to say that like we're equal in this. You had your empire, your press photos, your name on buildings. My mom had rent she could barely cover and chemo appointments she took the bus to." Jackson swallowed hard. "She told me about you," Eli continued, voice lower now. "Not much. Just that you had dreams too big to fit her in, that she didn't want to clip your wings." "She was wrong," Jackson whispered. "She was the only thing that kept me grounded. I just didn't see it in time." Eli looked away. There was a long silence. Somewhere behind them, an engine sputtered to life, then died. Finally, Jackson said, "You're an engineer?" Eli shrugged. "Studying, part-time at UC Berkeley. I fix bikes to cover the rest." "You're good at it." "I don't need your approval," Eli said, but there was something quieter under the defiance. Weariness, maybe, or curiosity he hadn't figured out how to shut down. "I'm not here to fix anything," Jackson said. I can't, but I can listen, if you'll let me." Eli stared at him, eyes unreadable. Then he turned back toward the bike, fingers returning to the engine. "You want to talk? Talk. But I've got 20 minutes before my shift ends and I'm not stopping work." Jackson exhaled. Fair enough. He sat on a stool nearby, watching his son's hands move with precision and care. The silence between them was brittle, but not broken. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson didn't feel like running. He just sat there, watching, waiting, hoping that 20 minutes might turn into something more. By the time Jackson returned to the city, the afternoon light had begun to fade, leaving the sky a moody blue-gray. The Porsche hummed along the Bay Bridge as his mind replayed every moment of that encounter. Eli's guarded stare, the contempt in his voice, and the way his hands never stopped moving. He hadn't offered forgiveness, but he hadn't walked away either. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't much. The parking valet was already waiting when he pulled into his private garage. "Welcome back, Mr. Reed," the young man said politely. Jackson nodded and handed over the keys, his mind still in that cluttered Berkeley garage, oil-streaked and humming with heat. Everything in his world was pristine by contrast: his car, his elevator, the lobby of his penthouse tower where classical music piped through unseen speakers. But after standing across from his son in a shop that smelled of grease and real life, it all felt sterile. The elevator opened to his floor with a quiet ding. He wasn't alone. Melissa was sitting on the velvet sectional in the living room, a glass of red wine in her hand and an expensive frown tugging at the corners of her perfectly made-up mouth. "You're back," she said flatly. He didn't bother with pretense. "I didn't think we had plans." "We didn't," she replied, standing. "But we haven't talked in days, and last night you cut me off like I was an assistant trying to reschedule your dry cleaning." He hung his coat on the hook by the door and turned to her. "I'm sorry." She crossed her arms. "That's not like you." He rubbed his temple. "Nothing feels like me right now." There was a pause. Melissa set her wine down, eyeing him the way she would a stubborn board member before a vote. "You want to tell me what's going on?" He hesitated. "I met someone," he said. Her face didn't move, but her eyes flared just enough to register it. "Someone," she repeated carefully. "His name is Eli. He's 23. He looked her dead in the eye. He's my son." Melissa blinked. For a moment she said nothing. Then, "You didn't tell me you had a son." "I didn't know. Not until 3 days ago." Her mouth tightened. "And you're just accepting that? You're not asking for proof? Not even a test?" "I don't need one," he said. "The second I looked at him, I knew." She picked up her glass again but didn't drink. "And what are you planning to do now? Move him into the guest suite? Announce it on your next investor call?" He stared at her. "I'm planning to get to know him, if he'll let me." Melissa's expression sharpened. "Jackson, I've worked hard to protect your image, our image. If this gets out, this isn't about PR. Everything's about PR when your name is on a $9 billion company." He exhaled. "I don't expect you to understand." "I do understand," she snapped. "I understand that we're supposed to be a team. You're the man I've stood beside at every board meeting, every gala, every power dinner. And now suddenly you're chasing after a stranger who claims to be your kid. He's not a stranger, he's mine." That silenced her. Jackson stepped closer, softening. "Look, I know this is a shock, but I can't ignore it. I won't." She stared at him, and for the first time in months he realized how far apart they really stood. Melissa set her glass down again and smoothed her dress. "Then maybe you need to figure out who you are right now, Jackson, because I'm not sure I recognize you anymore." She left without slamming the door. Melissa never slammed anything. She just closed it gently, So gently it hurt more. The next day, Jackson canceled everything. No meetings, no interviews, no handshakes with men in tailored suits who smiled too much. Instead, he called Claire. "Did I wake you?" he asked when she answered. "It's 9:30, Jackson. I run a nonprofit, not a yoga retreat." He smiled faintly. "I need a favor." "Go on." "Lunch, real food, not plated art, somewhere low-key." Claire chuckled. "Now you sound like a stranger." He met her at a quiet cafe in Hayes Valley, a place with wobbly chairs and chipped mugs where people actually talked instead of posing for Instagram. She wore jeans again and a denim jacket. Her curls were loose, and there was no makeup hiding the laugh lines around her eyes. "Rough day?" she asked after they sat. "Melissa left." Claire didn't look surprised. "Because of Eli?" "Because of everything," he said. "Because I'm changing, and she liked the version of me that never questioned anything." "She liked the sculpture," Claire murmured. "Not the clay." He looked at her. "And what about you? What did you like?" She tilted her head. "You were never boring, even when you were insufferable." He huffed a laugh. Claire leaned in. "Look, I can't tell you how to be a father, but I can tell you this. People don't need perfection. They need presence. And right now, that boy has no idea what to make of you. He has every reason not to trust me. Then give him reasons to." She sipped her coffee. "One conversation at a time." Jackson nodded slowly. That afternoon he sent Eli a text. "I know you don't owe me anything, but I'd like to talk again. I'll be at the cafe near your garage tomorrow at noon. If you come, I'll be there. If you don't, I'll keep showing up until you do." He hit send and stared at the screen, heart pounding. Then he waited. The cafe was modest, barely bigger than a studio apartment, with mismatched chairs, local artwork on the walls, and a chalkboard menu offering things like turmeric lattes and vegan blueberry muffins. It was the kind of place Jackson Reed would have walked past without noticing 6 months ago. But now he sat at a corner table, black coffee in hand, every nerve on edge. Noon came and went. 12:03, 12:08, 12:014. The chair across from him stayed empty. He told himself not to be surprised. Eli didn't owe him anything, not a conversation, not a response, not even a glance. But part of him had hoped. Foolishly, naively. He was about to leave when the bell over the door chimed. Eli walked in, the hood of his gray sweatshirt pushed back, hair damp from the misting rain outside. He scanned the room once, spotted Jackson, and made his way over. Jackson stood, uncertain if he should smile or stay neutral. Eli didn't give him a chance to decide. "I only have 15 minutes, he said, dropping into the seat. Jackson nodded. "I'll take whatever you're willing to give." A beat passed. Eli crossed his arms, leaned back. "So, what's the pitch this time?" "There's no pitch," Jackson said. "Just something I think you should see." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle of worn envelopes tied with faded twine. He laid them on the table between them, like a fragile offering. Eli stared. "What is that?" "Letters," Jackson said. "From your mom." Eli's mouth parted slightly, eyes narrowing. "Where did you get those?" "Her friend Claire had them. Said Mariah wrote them over the years but never sent them. Maybe she planned to one day. Maybe she didn't." Eli didn't move. "I've read a few." Jackson continued quietly. "I stopped halfway through. I figured they weren't meant just for me." Slowly, Eli reached out, fingers hovering over the brittle twine like it might crumble at his touch. He lifted the top envelope, then flipped it over. His mother's handwriting, familiar, intimate. "She kept these," he murmured. Jackson nodded. "Some are addressed to me, some to you." Eli swallowed hard and returned the bundle to the table. "Why are you giving them to me?" "Because they're yours as much as mine," Jackson said. "Maybe more." Eli didn't answer. The silence stretched. Finally he said, "She used to sit by the window at night writing. Said it helped her think. I always thought she was working on articles." Jackson felt something in his chest crack. "She was trying to make sense of something," he said. "Maybe of both of us." Eli glanced toward the cafe window, where rain streaked down the glass in tired lines. His voice came softer this time. "She used to tell me not to hate you." Jackson blinked. "She did?" "She never badmouthed you. Just said, you were a different kind of man. One who believed in building things. She said you'd built yourself so high you couldn't hear anything from the ground anymore." Jackson let the words settle. They weren't cruel, but they weren't wrong either. "I'm trying to change that," he said. Eli looked at him, not through him, at him. "Why?" The question wasn't angry, it was real. Jackson hesitated. Then, "Because when I lost her, I didn't understand what I was missing. But when I saw you, it hit me. You were right in front of me. A part of her, a part of me, and I couldn't walk away." Eli exhaled. The tightness in his shoulders eased just slightly. "I don't know what to do with any of this," he admitted. "You showing up, the letters, all of it." "You don't have to do anything," Jackson said. "You're not a project to be managed. I just want to be here, if you let me." A long pause. Then Eli pushed the letters toward himself, stood up, and grabbed his coffee. "I need time," he said. Jackson nodded. "Take all the time you need." Eli gave a tight nod in return and walked out, the bell above the door chiming once again. Jackson sat for a while longer, the seat across from him now empty, but the weight on his chest slightly lighter. Later that night, back in the penthouse, Jackson sat on the couch with one of the letters in his lap. It was dated 10 years ago. "Dear Jackson, today, Eli asked me why some people disappear. He was only 13, but he's already learned that some absences are louder than presence. I didn't know how to answer him. I wanted to tell him the truth. That I loved you once, maybe still do. That I didn't tell you about him because I was scared you'd choose the life you were building over the life we could have had. I want to believe that wasn't fair of me. But I also know you. And back then, you were chasing something no one could touch. Not even me. If you ever find this, I hope it means you've slowed down. I hope it means you're listening. And I hope you see him. Really see him. Because he is everything good you left behind." Jackson closed the letter with trembling hands, vision blurred. Outside, the rain began again, gentle and relentless. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel alone. The office felt different now. Jackson stood in the corner of the boardroom, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass, but he barely noticed it. Voices droned in the background. Analysts reporting quarterly earnings. Investors nodding along, numbers dancing across a screen. He should have cared. A year ago, he would have been leading the charge, pointing out inefficiencies, pushing for faster growth. But his mind wasn't in the room. It was still at that cafe in Berkeley, still with the image of Eli clutching that bundle of letters, jaw tight with something unspoken. A boy who didn't ask for anything, and probably never would. "Jackson?" The voice yanked him back. Terrence Klein, head of strategy and self-appointed keeper of ReedTech's vision, was staring at him across the sleek boardroom table. Salt and pepper hair slicked back. Charcoal suit, no tie. Clean lines, like the man had been carved out of stone and spreadsheets. "You've been quiet," Terrence said. "I assume you're still aligned with the merger vote?" Jackson glanced at the documents in front of him. The proposed merger with a defense tech conglomerate had been weeks in the making. Strategic, profitable, cold as hell. He closed the folder. I'm not. The room fell silent. Terrence raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? I'm not aligned, Jackson repeated, calmer this time. I'm voting no. Whispers rippled around the table. The younger execs looked confused, the older ones wary. Terrence's expression darkened. This is a multi-billion-dollar deal. It positions us globally. It positions us as something I don't want to be, Jackson cut in. I didn't build Reed Tech to fuel weapons development. You built it to win, Terrence shot back, to dominate. And this is how we do that. I built it to innovate, Jackson said, voice firm, to improve lives. If I wanted to get rich making bombs, I would have done it 20 years ago. A tense pause followed. Then Jackson stood. I'll sign off on allocating resources to medical AI expansion and clean infrastructure, but I'm pulling out of the merger. And if the board disagrees, you're free to bring it to a vote. He left the room without waiting for anyone's response. Claire found him that evening in the one place he rarely let anyone see, the rooftop garden of the Reed Tech building. It had been her suggestion years ago, when he first hired her as a consultant on sustainability. You can't build a company without roots, she'd told him, even if they're metaphorical. Tonight, the garden smelled of rosemary and rain. She stepped beside him, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, her cardigan damp at the sleeves. I heard about the boardroom fireworks, she said gently. He gave a humorless laugh. Word travels fast, especially when it's a CEO tanking a billion-dollar merger. He looked over at her. You disapprove? No, she said. I'm just surprised. You've always played the long game. I still am, he said. I just realized legacy isn't about what you build. It's about what you leave standing. She studied him for a moment. You've changed. Maybe. No, she said. You have, and not just because of Eli. He didn't respond, just watched as fog rolled in over the bay. Claire moved closer. Can I ask you something? He nodded. What if Eli never forgives you? What if he decides he doesn't want a relationship? He swallowed hard. Then I'll still show up, because knowing him, even a little, is better than spending another year pretending he doesn't exist. Claire smiled faintly. That's the man I knew once, before the world polished him into something shinier. He turned toward her. And what about us? She tilted her head. Us? You've been here. You've always been honest, steady. I didn't see it before. And now? She asked. I see a woman who never asked for a thing but gave me space to become a better version of myself. Claire was quiet for a moment, the air between them warm despite the wind. You're not who you were, she said. That's good, but I'm not here to be your reward for growth. He nodded slowly, his respect for her deepening. Then what are you here for? To see what happens next, she said, eyes soft. If you keep becoming. He took that in, no defense, no strategy, just a quiet sense of humility he hadn't felt in years. I'm not used to not having control, he admitted. No one really has it, she said. Some of us are just better at pretending. They stood side by side, not touching, but not apart either. The city buzzed beneath them, too big, too fast. But in that moment, the rooftop felt like the only place that mattered. And Jackson knew this wasn't a chapter he could write alone. The restaurant Claire chose wasn't one of Jackson's usual haunts. It had no valet, no sommeliers gliding between tables with choreographed grace. Just a cozy, dimly lit bistro tucked into a quiet corner of the Mission District. Wooden floors that creaked slightly underfoot. Candles melting into wine bottles, and a menu handwritten in chalk. She sat across from him in a deep green blouse and jeans, her earrings small silver hoops that swayed when she laughed. It struck him, not for the first time, how much lighter she seemed than the world he was used to. How present. Jackson took a sip of his wine. I forgot places like this existed. Claire smirked. That's what happens when your name's on too many buildings. You start thinking only high-rises matter. He chuckled. I used to think this kind of place was inefficient. No reservations, unpredictable wait times. She leaned in. And now? He glanced around the room. Now it feels like the only kind of place I want to be. Claire didn't respond right away. Her eyes, clear and calm, held his a moment too long. You're changing, she said finally. But the question is, are you just reacting to guilt, or are you finally letting go of the person you thought you were supposed to be? Jackson set down his glass, folding his hands on the table. I don't have an answer to that yet. She smiled gently. That's honest. I'll take it. Before he could reply, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He started to ignore it, but something told him to check. Unknown number. A short text. I read the first letter. Meet me for dinner tomorrow? No name, no flourish, just straight to the point. Jackson stared at it for a beat, his heart skipping. Claire leaned forward. Good news? He looked up, breath caught. It's Eli. Her face softened. Wow. He wants to meet. Dinner. She nodded slowly. That's something. It's everything. Jackson sent a quick reply before he could overthink it. Absolutely. You name the place. He looked back at Claire, his expression uncertain. What if I mess this up? You will, she said without missing a beat. That's what being in someone's life means. You show up anyway. Eli chose a no-frills Thai spot in downtown Oakland. Jackson arrived early, pacing the sidewalk like a man on trial. The restaurant had bright fluorescent lights, laminated menus, and the scent of lemongrass and garlic wafting into the night air. When Eli walked in, he looked different, cleaner than the garage, but still casual. Dark jeans, a fitted black tee, boots worn but not falling apart. He scanned the room and spotted Jackson instantly. Jackson stood. Hey. Eli gave a slight nod. Didn't expect you to show up early. I didn't want to give you a reason to leave. They sat. The waitress came by with water and a menu. Eli ordered Pad See You. Jackson mirrored him. For a few minutes they sat in silence, the clatter of dishes and soft Thai pop music filling the space between them. Finally, Eli spoke. I read the one she wrote when I turned 10. Jackson nodded slowly. I remember that one. She said she thought about telling you, but she didn't want to be your obligation. I never would have seen it that way. Maybe, but she didn't know that. Eli stirred his water with a straw. She was scared, I think. Not just of being disappointed, but of disappointing you. Jackson's throat tightened. She never could have done that. Eli looked up. That's not what you told her when you chose New York over Boston. Jackson flinched. Number it's not. Their food arrived, offering a temporary reprieve. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Then Jackson said, What do you want to know? About me, I mean. Eli looked thoughtful. I don't know. I've Googled you, watched the interviews, read the bios, but none of them tell me who you were when you weren't trying to conquer the world. Jackson exhaled. I was scared. Eli blinked. Of what? Of being small, Jackson said. Of not being enough. I thought success would protect me from that. Did it? No, Jackson said quietly. It made it worse. Everything became performance, even my relationships. Eli stared at him, a muscle twitching in his jaw. That's honest. I'll take it. Jackson smiled, faint but real. The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted. From resistance to curiosity. "I'm not trying to replace anything," Jackson said. "And I know I have no right to ask for a relationship." Eli leaned back, arms crossed. "So, why are you here?" "Because I want one anyway." Eli didn't reply right away. When he finally spoke, it was quiet. "I don't know what this is yet, but I'm willing to keep the door cracked. That's all I can ask." Eli stood first, sliding his hands into his jacket pockets. "Same time next week?" Jackson rose, hope threading through his chest. "You got it." Outside, they walked a block in silence before parting ways. And for the first time, Jackson didn't feel like a man chasing the past. He felt like someone learning to live in the present. The following week, Jackson and Eli met again, then again, and again. Always the same low-key places, ramen in the Mission, tacos in Fruitvale, once even just coffee and silence in a park near Lake Merritt. Eli never asked for anything. Jackson never pushed. It was fragile, whatever they were building, like a wire stretched between them, taut, unspoken, held together by cautious curiosity and the sheer force of what might have been. Still, Jackson began to breathe a little easier. The wall between them, though still present, had started to lower by inches. But then came the call. It was a rainy Tuesday morning. Jackson was in his office, distractedly reading reports, when his assistant buzzed in. "Mr. Reed, there's someone here to see you, Ms. Daniela Torres." The name hit him like a gust of cold air. "Send her in," he said. Daniela entered moments later, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. Her hair was pulled back into a tight braid, her coat still damp. She looked exactly like he remembered, unforgiving and impossible to intimidate. "I figured you'd resurface eventually," she said, walking past his desk without waiting to be invited. Jackson stood. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough." He gestured toward a chair. She didn't sit. "So," she said, arms crossed, "you're back in his life." Jackson kept his voice even. "I didn't know he existed, Daniela." She scoffed. "Don't play innocent. Mariah didn't keep that secret for fun. She didn't tell you because she knew you'd turn him into another checkbox, another trophy, and now you're doing exactly that. That's not fair." "No? You've already had 3 dinners with him, according to Eli. You're giving advice, talking future plans." Jackson frowned. "He told you that?" "He tells me everything. I raised him after she died. I'm not just his godmother. I'm the closest thing to family he had, until you waltzed in with your tailored suits and redemption arc." Her words hit harder than he expected. "I'm not trying to rewrite the past," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to be present now." Daniela's gaze sharpened. "Then be honest. About who you were, what you did, what you didn't do." "I never abandoned him. I didn't even know—" "But you abandoned her," she cut in. "You left Mariah to choose between loving you and keeping her dignity. She needed you, and you made her feel like a speed bump on your way to an IPO." Jackson flinched. "She never stopped loving you," Daniela said, voice cracking slightly. "But she knew who you were. That's why she kept him away." He felt the weight of that land, and still he said, "People change." "Prove it," she said. "Because if you hurt him, Jackson, I swear, money or not, legacy or not, I will come for you." With that, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the floor like punctuation marks. Later that night, Jackson waited at the corner booth of the diner Eli had picked. He watched the rain hit the window in erratic rhythms, tried to shake the conversation with Daniela from his head. Eli arrived 5 minutes late, hoodie damp, hair tousled. He slid into the booth. "Hey," Jackson offered a small smile. "Hey." A waitress came by, dropped off 2 mugs of coffee like she knew the drill. They sat in quiet for a moment. Eli tapped his fingers against the table. Jackson recognized the nervous energy. He did the same thing when something was on his mind. "Daniela came to see me today," Jackson said. Eli looked up, surprised. "She did?" "She thinks I'm going to disappoint you." Eli gave a humorless laugh. "She's not wrong to be worried." Jackson nodded. "I told her I don't want anything from you, except the chance to know you. That's still true." Eli looked down at his coffee, then softly, "She found out about you a few days before Mom died. She wanted to write, to tell you, but she was afraid it was too late." Jackson swallowed the lump in his throat. "It never would have been too late." "Maybe," Eli said, "but she didn't want you to feel trapped or guilty. She wanted you to come to us for the right reasons." "I wish I had." Eli looked up. His expression was serious now. "So tell me, what are your reasons?" Jackson exhaled. At first it was shock, then guilt. But now, he paused, choosing his words. "Now it's just want. I want to know who you are. I want to earn your trust. I want a second chance, not at being perfect, but at being real." Eli didn't answer right away. The air between them felt heavier. "I'm scared of becoming you," he said finally. Jackson blinked. "What?" "I see the drive, the perfectionism, the control. It's in me too. When I work, when I plan, I get obsessed. I shut people out. And I wonder, what if I hurt someone the way you hurt Mom?" Jackson leaned in. "Then don't. Learn from what I did wrong. That's what we're supposed to do, as fathers, as men." Eli looked at him, his eyes filled with questions he hadn't yet figured out how to ask. And then something shifted. A softening. A crack of light in the armor. Jackson reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "She wrote this the week before she died. It's the last one." He slid it across the table. Eli stared at it, didn't touch it. Not yet. "I'll read it later," he said. Jackson nodded. "Take your time." They finished their coffee in silence. Outside, the rain had stopped. The next morning, Jackson stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, but the reflection staring back at him looked unfamiliar. Not because of the gray at his temples or the lines that time and success had etched into his face, but because something inside had shifted. The armor he'd worn for years no longer fit. It pinched in the wrong places, sagged in others. Power still clung to him, but it no longer defined him. He stepped out onto the penthouse terrace, phone in hand, the city stretching endlessly below. A message from Eli sat unread. Finished the letter. "Need some space. I'll reach out." It wasn't rejection, but it stung just the same. He slid the phone into his pocket and headed for the elevator. At Reed Tech, the building buzzed with its usual polished intensity. Executives tapping away on tablets, assistants trailing behind with lattes and legal pads, conference rooms lit like sets. But today it all felt like a stage he didn't want to perform on. He barely made it into his office before his assistant appeared at the door. "Terrence is waiting in the executive lounge. He said you're late." Jackson exhaled, checked his watch out of habit. Let him wait. The lounge was all leather, brass, and glass, a space built to impress visiting board members and remind staff who ran the empire. Terrence was seated by the window, nursing a black coffee like it was ammunition. He stood when Jackson walked in. "I assume you've seen the press leak." Jackson didn't flinch. "Not yet." Terrence tapped his tablet and turned the screen. A headline blinked across the top. Jackson Reed's secret son, Reed Tech CEO faces personal scandal as family ties surface. Below it, grainy photos, Jackson and Eli outside the Thai restaurant, and another of Eli at the motorcycle shop. It hit like a sucker punch. Jackson slowly sat. "Where did this come from?" Terrence's expression didn't shift. "It doesn't matter. The board's concerned. Your personal life is bleeding into public perception. Our valuation is down 3% in pre-market." Jackson stared at him. And? And they want a statement, something clean, contained. Jackson laughed, sharp, bitter. You mean spin it. Spin it, clarify it, deny it, pick your poison. But if you don't address this, they'll start wondering if you're still the man to lead this company. Jackson leaned back in the chair, his pulse settling into a low, angry thrum. I'm still the man who built this company, but I'm not the man who lies to protect a facade. Terrence raised an eyebrow. So what's the plan? Parade the boy in front of reporters? Turn him into a rebranding strategy? No, Jackson said, his voice cold now. The plan is to protect him. From people like you. Terrence set the tablet down. Be careful, Jackson. Sentimentality is expensive. Jackson stood. So is silence. And I've been quiet long enough. That evening he met Claire at her apartment, a cozy, lived-in space with books stacked in corners and string lights draped over the window. She opened the door barefoot, holding a glass of wine. You saw it? She asked, stepping aside. He nodded, walking in. Front page scandal, just what every father and son need when trying to rebuild something. Claire handed him the wine. Sit, breathe. He did. She perched on the armrest beside him. Does Eli know? He hasn't called. I don't know if he saw it or if he's gone dark because of the letter. Claire was quiet for a beat. What did the letter say? She said goodbye, in her way. Told him he was loved, that she'd always wanted him to know who he came from, but also that she didn't want him defined by it. Claire's eyes softened. That sounds like her. Jackson nodded, emotion tightening in his throat. He read it and went quiet. I don't blame him. She laid a hand on his shoulder. He'll come back. But right now he's reeling. From grief, from truth, from the sudden spotlight. Give him space, but stay visible. He looked up at her, the questions surfacing without words. About her. About them. Claire saw it, met it. You're not a man who loves halfway, she said softly. But if you're going to ask me to stand with you, make sure you're not doing it just because the rest of your world's falling apart. I'm not, he said. I just finally see what I kept missing. Claire leaned in, pressing her lips gently to his forehead. Then take care of your son. And when he's ready, we'll figure out the rest. Later that night, Jackson sat alone in the dark of his penthouse, city lights flickering like stars below. He opened a new message to Eli. Typed, deleted, typed again. I saw the article. I'm sorry this touched your life before you were ready. I didn't want this to happen, but I won't pretend you're not mine just to make the world more comfortable. I'm proud of you, and I'm here, whenever you're ready. He hit send, and for the first time in a very long time, Jackson didn't feel the need to control the outcome. He just hoped. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. Jackson had just begun to drift, his mind foggy from the weight of too many sleepless nights, when the sharp, deliberate rapping pulled him from bed. He reached the door in his robe, expecting security, maybe a package left too late. But when he opened it, Eli stood there, soaked from the rain, hoodie clinging to him, eyes wild with something between anger and disbelief. Jackson blinked, stunned. Eli, I need to talk, Eli said. Now. Jackson stepped aside without a word. Eli walked in like a storm, wet footprints on polished floors, rain dripping from his sleeves. He didn't sit, just stood near the kitchen island, fists clenched, breathing hard. I went to Daniela's tonight, he said, voice tight. She gave me a box. Said Mom asked her to keep it safe in case I ever found you. Jackson nodded slowly. I didn't know there was anything else. Eli pulled a plastic envelope from his jacket and dropped it on the island. Jackson opened it gently. Inside were copies of emails. all dated 24 years ago, all from Mariah, all to him. Jackson stared. "I thought she never tried," he whispered. "She did," Eli said, bitter. "Multiple times before I was born, right after, she reached out. Told you she was pregnant. Told you she was scared. She wanted to talk." Jackson's breath caught. "I never saw these." Eli's voice rose. "They're addressed to your old email, the one listed on your company profile at the time. She even wrote in the last one, 'I don't know if this is the right address anymore. Please, just answer.'" Jackson read the words, his vision blurring. "I changed email servers that year," he said hoarsely. "We had a breach. The IT team rebuilt everything, scrapped the old accounts." He looked up. "I never got them." Eli's mouth twisted. "And you never looked for her?" "Not really." Jackson took a step closer. "That's not true." "She was alone," Eli said. "Working 2 jobs, going to chemo appointments without a car. And you—" He shook his head. "You were buying penthouses and getting profiled in Forbes." Jackson closed his eyes. "I was chasing something I thought mattered. And now? Now I know better." The silence between them stretched. The only sound was the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass. Finally, Jackson said, "You think I'm the villain in this story?" Eli's jaw clenched. "I don't know what you are." "I was a man who thought he had time," Jackson said. "I believed I could always go back. That someday I'd reconnect with her, maybe explain everything. But time doesn't wait for redemption." He held up the letters. "You're right to be angry. I'd be angry too." Eli finally sat, elbows on the counter, head in his hands. "I read the last letter," he said. "The one from the week she died." Jackson swallowed. "What did she say?" "That she never stopped loving you. That she wished she'd been braver." Eli looked up. "And that she hoped I'd forgive you." Jackson's breath caught. "Do you?" Eli didn't answer right away. "I want to," he said, "but I don't know how." Jackson stepped forward. "Start small. Yell at me when you need to. Ask questions I might not know how to answer, but stay." Eli watched him for a long, silent moment. Then quietly, "Why didn't you come to her funeral?" Jackson looked pained. "I didn't know until 3 days after she was buried. Daniela sent a message, but I was on a jet. I found out after it was too late." He stepped closer. "But I went. A week later. I've been back every year." Eli sat with that, let it settle. "Then come with me this year," he said. "On her birthday." Jackson froze. "When?" "Next week." "I'll be there." They stood in the kitchen, not as strangers, not yet as family, but as 2 people beginning to understand what they'd lost and what they still had the chance to rebuild. Eli wiped his sleeve across his face. "I should go." Jackson nodded. "I'll walk you down." At the elevator, Eli turned. "You weren't the villain," he said. "You were just missing." Jackson felt something in his chest loosen. "I'm not missing now." The elevator opened. Eli stepped inside. This time he didn't look away when the doors closed. Mariah Rivera's birthday fell on a Thursday. The air was crisp as Jackson stepped out of the black sedan, the cemetery's iron gates looming ahead like old sentinels. A low mist curled around the gravestones, turning the grass silver in the morning light. He clutched a single bouquet of white orchids in his hand, the same he brought every year, but this time the gesture felt heavier, more exposed. This time he wouldn't be alone. Eli stood by the grave already, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, head slightly bowed. He wore no flowers, no sign of ritual, just presence. That alone felt monumental. Jackson approached slowly. His footsteps were muffled in the damp grass, the sound of the city just a dull hum beyond the stone walls. "She hated birthdays," Eli said. voice flat but not unkind. Said they were just reminders that time doesn't wait. Jackson offered a soft smile. She used to say that when we were in school. I thought she was being dramatic. She was dramatic, Eli murmured, but she wasn't wrong. They stood together in silence for a moment, the fog beginning to burn off in slow layers. Jackson knelt and placed the orchids at the base of the grave. Mariah Rivera, 1975 to 2020. Beloved mother, fierce friend, eternal soul. She wanted more time, Eli said, quieter now. She never said it out loud, but I could feel it. Jackson swallowed the lump rising in his throat. She always made it seem like she had forever. She never wanted anyone to worry. Except you, Eli added. She worried about you all the time. Jackson looked at him. She kept your interviews on a flash drive, news clippings, every article she could find. Said you were too far away to touch, but close enough to remember. Jackson's eyes burned. I didn't deserve that kind of loyalty. No, Eli agreed, but she gave it anyway. Jackson nodded slowly, the admission seeping into his bones. And I ran. From her, from anything that felt uncontrollable. I told myself it was about the mission, the vision, but it was fear, pure fear. Eli stared straight ahead, voice quieter. She was terrified too, of needing too much, of being a burden. She was never that. She didn't believe it. They let the silence fall again. The sky was starting to clear. Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter, creased, smudged at the edges. He handed it to Jackson. She wrote this one for you, he said, but never mailed it. Daniela found it in a stack of old receipts. Jackson opened the letter carefully. Jackson, if you're reading this, it means Eli found you. And you stayed. Thank you. I used to dream about that. About you sitting across from him, seeing his fire, his stubbornness. He has your eyes, your defiance. But he's better than us, Jack. He's kinder. He listens. I wanted to tell you the truth, so many times. But pride is a cruel thing. It convinces you that silence is strength, that disappearing is mercy. If you can forgive me for that, then maybe he can forgive you too. Don't give up on him, even if he pulls away. Especially then. You're not the man I needed back then. But maybe, just maybe, you can be the father he needs now. Be steady. Be real. And when you don't know what to say, just show up. Jackson folded the letter slowly, unable to speak. She was braver than both of us, he said finally. Yeah, Eli replied. She was. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around them. The weight of grief didn't lift, but it settled. Became something they could hold together. Eli turned to Jackson. You doing anything tonight? Jackson looked at him, surprised. No plans. I'm meeting some friends, at a bar near the lake. You don't have to stay long. Jackson felt his chest tighten, not with nerves, but with hope. I'd like that, he said. Thank you. Eli nodded, already turning away. I'll text you the address. As he walked off down the gravel path, Jackson stayed by the grave a moment longer. He reached down and touched the stone. Thank you, he whispered. For both of us. Then he stood tall, his breath visible in the cold air, and followed the path his son had just taken, toward something uncertain, but finally, real. The bar near Lake Merritt was the kind of place Jackson would have driven past 100 times without noticing. No glowing signage, no valet, just a carved wooden door with chipped paint and the low thrum of jazz leaking out onto the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment, glancing down at the address Eli had texted, then back up at the door. This wasn't his world, but Eli had invited him in, and that mattered more than comfort. Inside, the place was dim and warm, with worn leather booths, low lighting, and a tiny stage where a woman with a smoky voice crooned to a saxophone. Jackson scanned the room until he spotted Eli, seated at a corner table with two friends, one with a buzz cut and a wide smile, the other in a beanie, flipping a coaster between her fingers. Eli looked up and saw him. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away. That was enough. Jackson approached, unsure of the script. "Hey," Eli said. "You came." Jackson nodded. "You invited me." Eli motioned to the empty chair beside him. "This is Marcus and Lila. We work together." "Nice to meet you," Jackson said, offering a hand. Marcus shook it, curious. "So, you're the mystery man." Jackson glanced at Eli. "Guilty, I guess." Lila raised an eyebrow. "He said you were complicated. You look like the guy from that AI commercial." Jackson laughed softly. "I get that a lot." They talked for a while. About motorcycles, school projects, the weather. Nothing heavy, nothing too close to the edge. Jackson mostly listened, but when he spoke, he didn't try to impress. He just was. And somewhere in the middle of the second round of drinks, something shifted. Eli looked over and said, "They're pitching senior capstone projects next week. I'm thinking clean energy retrofits for combustion engines." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You've already got the designs, don't you?" Eli shrugged. "Maybe." Marcus grinned. "He's a freak, doesn't sleep." Jackson nodded. "Sounds familiar." For the first time, Eli smirked. "You saying I got that from you?" "Probably," Jackson said. "Sorry in advance." That got a laugh, real and unguarded from all three of them. Later, Eli walked him out. The night air was cool, the lake behind them rippling in the moonlight. "I wasn't sure you'd fit in," Eli said. Jackson slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "Neither was I. But you didn't try to take over the room." Jackson smiled faintly. "That's new." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Eli said, "I got an offer. Internship. From a clean tech startup in Portland." Jackson's heart gave a quick, irrational jolt. "That's great." "It is. But it's unpaid. 3 months. I'd have to leave school for the summer. Figure out housing." Jackson hesitated. "What do you want to do?" "I want to go," Eli said. "But I don't want to owe anyone." "You don't," Jackson said. "Not for that. Not for anything." Eli glanced at him. "You offering to help?" "I'm offering options," Jackson said. "But you make the choice." Eli nodded slowly. "Then here's what I want. If you really want to be in my life, don't just show up when it's heavy. Show up when it's normal, too. When I don't need anything. I can do that. And," Eli added, his voice quieter now, "I want to keep reading her letters. With you? Not all at once. Just when we're ready." Jackson felt something tighten in his throat. He nodded. "I'd like that." As they stood there under the soft hum of the street lamp, Jackson reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I started something," he said. "I don't know if it's any good, but it's for you." Eli took it carefully. "What is it?" "A letter," Jackson said. "My first." Eli didn't open it. He just held it like it was something worth keeping. "Okay," he said. "Thanks." Jackson stepped back. "You want to ride?" "Nah," Eli said. "I'm walking. Clears my head." Jackson nodded. And then, before turning to go, Eli said, "You're not who I thought you were." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Better or worse?" "Still deciding," Eli said, a hint of a grin. "But I'm not walking away." Jackson watched his son disappear down the street, tall and steady under the city lights. He stood there a long moment, heart full in a way that had nothing to do with success or legacy. This ordinary night, this fragile peace, was everything he never knew he needed. 3 weeks later, the sun had finally remembered how to shine in San Francisco. The fog had lifted, leaving behind streets warmed by soft gold light and the kind of breeze that hinted spring might actually hold this time. Jackson stood at the back of a converted warehouse in Soma, watching as Eli presented to a room full of tech investors and design mentors. The event was a student-led innovation showcase, the kind of thing Jackson used to brush off with a generous donation instead of attending in person. Now he wouldn't have missed it for anything. Eli stood tall at the front of the room, pointing to a sleek mock-up of a modular retrofit system for combustion engines, lightweight, affordable, and entirely student-designed. His voice was steady, clear. He talked about energy equity, about sustainability in low-income communities, about how engineering had to mean more than patents, and patents had to mean more than profit. Jackson leaned against the back wall, arms crossed over his chest, smiling quietly. He didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to step into the spotlight. This moment belonged to Eli. Afterward, the room buzzed with applause. A few students gathered around Eli, asking questions. Jackson waited off to the side, letting the attention play out naturally. Eventually, Eli made his way over, still riding the high. "You crushed it," Jackson said. Eli grinned. "You think?" "I know." Eli shifted, almost shy. "They offered me a summer contract. Paid, short-term, but with potential to grow." Jackson nodded, proud. "That's big. I want to do it on my own. I will do it on my own, but I wanted you to be the first to know." Jackson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Before either could say more, Claire appeared from the crowd with 2 paper cups of lemonade in hand. "I told him not to downplay the environmental impact numbers," she said, handing Eli a cup. Eli laughed. "Yeah, well, I still hate talking about myself." Jackson looked between them, warmth rising in his chest. "You two have been conspiring behind my back, haven't you?" Claire smirked. "He needed a sounding board, and you needed someone to make sure you didn't try to manage him like a quarterly report." Jackson raised a hand in mock surrender. "Guilty." They stepped out into the sunlight, the 3 of them walking toward the sidewalk, moving like people who had learned to pace their strides together. "Have dinner with us tonight," Jackson said to Eli. "Nothing fancy, just home. I'll cook." Claire glanced at him, amused. "You'll cook?" "I've been watching videos," Jackson said. "Turns out risotto is just persistence in a saucepan." Eli chuckled. "That actually sounds great." As they walked to the parking lot, Claire slowed just slightly beside Jackson. "You're different," she said quietly. He looked at her, eyes soft. "I'm trying." "You're succeeding," she murmured. "And not because of the money, because of the work." They stood by her car for a moment before she got in. She touched his hand briefly. "Call me tomorrow." "I will." Eli waited by Jackson's car, hands in his pockets, watching them with something between curiosity and ease. "She likes you," he said once Claire pulled away. Jackson smirked. "Yeah, I like her too." Eli tilted his head. "You gonna mess it up?" Jackson paused. "I used to think being loved was about being admired. Now I know it's about being seen and still chosen." Eli smiled faintly. "That's a pretty good answer." They drove home with the windows cracked, the conversation light, about nothing and everything. Jackson felt the weight he'd carried for decades shift to something new. Not gone, but changed. At the penthouse, the risotto was clumpy, the salad overdressed, and Eli refused a second helping of both. Still, it was the best meal Jackson had ever made. Later, they stood side by side on the terrace, city lights glittering below. "I didn't know if I wanted this," Eli said. "Us, you, any of it." Jackson nodded. "Me either. Not at first." "But now?" Jackson looked at his son. "Now I can't imagine anything else mattering more." Eli leaned against the railing, exhaled deeply. I think she'd be happy, he said quietly. Jackson didn't answer right away, just looked out over the city, heart full, finally steady. I know she would. A year to the day after that first storm-soaked encounter at Mariah's grave, Jackson stood beside Eli in the same quiet cemetery. The sky was clear this time, a soft breeze rippling through the trees. Spring had settled in gently, coaxing out new leaves and blossoms that clung to the branches like whispered promises. Eli knelt and placed a small bouquet at the base of the headstone, lilies and lavender arranged simply. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't have to. Jackson waited beside him, his own hands empty. Eli's flowers were enough. She'd like this, Eli said finally, standing. Us. Here. Together. Jackson nodded. She always hoped it would happen. She just didn't live long enough to see it. Eli looked over. But we did. That landed somewhere deep, and Jackson found himself swallowing against the lump in his throat. They stood in silence for a long moment, not as strangers anymore, not even as a story of reconciliation, just a father and son, remembering the woman who had connected them, and, in her absence, reshaped them. When they finally turned to leave, Eli said, "You're still coming next week, right? Portland?" Jackson smiled. "Already booked my flight." Eli was headed to Portland for a second-round interview with the same clean tech startup, this time for a full-time role. He'd finish his degree remotely part-time. It was unconventional, uncertain, but it was his. And Jackson had learned not to control the outcome, only to support the journey. They reached the car, and before they got in, Eli reached into his coat and handed Jackson something. A letter, folded, worn at the corners, but clearly untouched. "I wrote this a few months ago," Eli said. "Meant to give it to you at the holidays, but it didn't feel like the right time." Jackson looked at it. "Should I read it now?" Eli shrugged. "Up to you. It's not for closure. It's just part of the story." Jackson nodded and slipped the letter into his coat. They drove in companionable quiet back to the city. That night, Jackson sat on the terrace of the penthouse. The lights of San Francisco stretched before him like scattered jewels. A year ago, this view had made him feel untouchable. Now it just reminded him how important it was to come back down to earth. He opened Eli's letter carefully. "Dad, that still feels strange to write, but it fits better now. When we first met, I didn't trust you. I didn't trust what you represented, wealth, absence, ambition, but I've come to realize it wasn't the money I resented. It was the silence. You filled the world with your name, your work, your accomplishments. But the quiet spaces, the ones that mattered, you left empty. Until now. You've shown up for me, not as a billionaire or a boss, but as a man. Flawed, trying, present. I'll never get those years back. But I don't want to live stuck in what we missed. I want to build what comes next. I'm proud to be your son. Not because of your legacy, because of your growth. Love." Eli Jackson folded the letter slowly, eyes wet. He didn't wipe the tears away. They belonged. He stood and turned toward the door just as Claire stepped out onto the terrace. She carried 2 mugs of tea and wore a cardigan that kept slipping off her shoulder. Her presence, as always, was grounding. "I thought you might still be out here," she said softly, handing him a mug. He took it, wrapping his hands around the warmth. "It's been a year." "I know." He looked at her. "Thank you for staying." Claire smiled. "Thank you for becoming someone worth staying for." He chuckled. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. It's also the truest." They sat together, the night cool but comforting. "I want to do more," Jackson said quietly. "Not just for Eli, for others. I've been thinking about a foundation, one that gives resources to single parents, to kids like Eli. Quiet help, real help, Claire nodded. That sounds like the kind of legacy worth leaving. He turned to her, suddenly sure of the words he hadn't said yet. Come with me, he said. Not just tonight. Come with me. Wherever this leads. Claire's smile didn't falter. You sure? I've never been more. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Then I'm all in. They sat like that for a long time, letting the city breathe around them. Jackson had built towers and companies, chased numbers and power. But nothing compared to the fragile, beautiful architecture of trust and love he was building now, with Eli, with Claire, with the man he'd finally become. And when the wind picked up just slightly, carrying the scent of spring through the air, Jackson imagined Mariah smiling somewhere just out of view. He whispered into the quiet, "We're doing okay."